Welcome to Polperro, one of the most beautiful fishing villages in Cornwall. Home to just over 1,000 permanent residents, idyllic seaside views, and a steady flow of visitors from around the world. And on this walk around Polperro, we'll make our way through the village's labyrinth of narrow lanes between a dense collection of centuries-old houses. And we'll discover Polperro's rich, swashbuckling history, from the traditional local industry of fishing to stories of smuggling, as well as an array of unusual landmarks, from the village's famous shell house to a shop named after the queen of the Cornish pixies, and of course the tranquil waters of the River Pol, which flows through the heart of the village and out into Polperro's perfectly preserved historic harbour. All of that is to come over the next 25 minutes, but we begin by taking in a view of the village harbour, a quintessentially Cornish vista that has remained almost entirely unchanged for hundreds of years. Nestled between steep cliffs on Cornwall's south coast, Polperro has been a busy centre of fishing for as many as 800 years. And throughout all that time, locals have been venturing out on small boats from this harbour into the waters of the English Channel, which we can see out in the distance just beyond the harbour mouth here. Historically, the waters off Polperro, like many other places in Cornwall, have been rich with pilchards in particular, and so it was pilchards which helped to make Polperro's fishing fleet famous. After being caught out at sea, local fishermen would bring the pilchards back to the village where they would be processed and salted, and then they were sold to customers far and wide. In fact, during the height of the village's fishing heyday, Polperro pilchards were exported all across Europe, in particular to Catholic Mediterranean nations like Italy and Spain, where the fish were eaten as part of religious fasting. Now, Polperro was by no means the only pilchard port on Cornwall's south coast, but it was one of the most prosperous, and much of that has to do with the view that greets us at the mouth of the village harbour here. This narrow coastal inlet is surrounded on almost all sides by steep cliffs and rock faces, and this provides an exceptional degree of protection and shelter from the often harsh winds and waves of the English Channel. And through history, this allowed a bustling harbourside community to develop in relative safety from the elements. Of course, the protection wasn't entirely bulletproof, and Polperro has indeed suffered at the hands of a number of vicious sea storms through time. But it was still a vital shield for the village in more ways than one. These cliffs also protected locals from prying eyes during the days of smuggling, and today they crowd around this delightful sheltered beach, one of the most popular spots where tourists to the village like to relax in the modern day. With iconic and idyllic views like the one of the harbour before us here, Polperro is regularly lauded as one of Cornwall's most beautiful villages, but it's also popular among tourists for its swashbuckling history of smuggling from yesteryear. Just down below us here, you might notice a small cave on the beach. It's known as Willy Wilcox's cave, and according to local legend, it was used by a man named Willy Wilcox to store smuggled contraband, directly below the cottage in which he lived. Guarded from the eyes of the law by the surrounding cliffs, smuggling was once big business in Polperro, during a period in the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the British government was levying extortionate taxes on imports into the country, in order to fund a number of expensive wars with France, America, and others around the world. This was inevitably unpopular among ordinary people in Britain, and so smuggling operations became rife along the country's coasts, with quaint seaside villages from here in Cornwall to Devon, Dorset, and as far away as Yorkshire, being transformed into hives of underhand trade for decades. Now today, there's a romanticism associated with smuggling that plays its part in drawing visitors to Polperro. And while you're in the village, you'll find plenty of delightful historic inns and pubs where you can enjoy a drink and a sit down. Just here, for instance, we find the Blue Peter Inn, a beautiful 18th century pub that was historically frequented by Polperro's many fishing families, and without doubt, its many smugglers too. It's a charming pub right by the harbour mouth, but nowadays it's perhaps most notable for its name, which doesn't come from the famous children's TV show, but rather from the flag that we can see flying on the right. That is the Blue Peter, a nautical signal traditionally raised on ships just before a voyage is set to begin, signalling that all persons should report on board the ship as it's about to set sail. Of course, the Blue Peter Inn, close to the exit of Polperro's Harbour, would likely have been the place where people would have had their last drink on land before setting out to sea from this village. Looking at the harbour now though, nobody's going to be setting sail from Polperro for a few hours, because this historic haven is a tidal harbour. The water level decreases, or as we can see now entirely vanishes, at low tide. Lining the harbour here, meanwhile, is a row of quaint stalls selling trinkets and snacks to tourists. But you'll also find a number of spots which sell locally caught fish. After all, tourism may be big business nowadays, but fishing remains an active industry here. And the village's fish market, located just beside the working harbour, is often a great place to find fresh catches brought in by local fishing boats. Not just pilchards, but also mackerel, lobsters, crabs, pollock, and plenty more. The stocks of pilchards that were once so plentiful off the coast here have diminished over time. But back in the day, it's hard to overstate just how much this village was dominated by pilchards. These fish, effectively larger-sized sardines, were for centuries caught, processed, and sold by the people of Polperro. And by the 19th century, as technology had developed, pilchards were being caught in truly enormous quantities. In order to cope, not one, not two, but 3 separate pilchard factories were established in this small Cornish village. And that is said to be the origin behind the name of Polperro's oldest pub, the Three Pilchards. Built around 500 years ago in the early 16th century, the Three Pilchards holds an important place in the fabric of this village's history. And it's also said to be the place where Polperro pilchard exports became truly international. The story goes that 2 Italian brothers visited Polperro, already famous for its pilchards, in the 19th century. And they stopped inside this pub, where they decided that they wanted to sample the fish from each of the village's 3 different pilchard factories. Their plan was to select the best, and then begin exporting fish all the way to their hometown in Italy, where they expected to make a fortune, fish being the traditional food of choice for the nation's Catholics on Fridays and during the period of Lent. But pilchard sales aren't the only link between Polperro and the Mediterranean. Here we're walking up onto a small road bridge which crosses over the harbour. It's known rather unusually as Roman Bridge, but it actually dates from 1854 and was not built by the Romans. Where the name comes from isn't exactly clear, but the bridge provides an important crossing point of the river, which flows through the village and out into the harbour, the River Pol. Now barely visible in the village centre as houses were built on every available space, even hanging over the water, the River Pol flows down the cliffs from the inland village of Plint, and out into the sea here at Polperro. The River Pol likely takes its name from the village of Polperro, which in the local Cornish language is known as Porthpyrrha, very simply meaning Piran's Harbour. Surprisingly, we can't be entirely sure who or what Piran is. Most believe that the name refers to none other than Saint Piran, a 5th century monk who's also regarded as the patron saint of Cornwall, and who lends his name to St. Piran's flag, the famous black and white cross which represents this proud region of Britain. On the other hand, some say that Pyrrha, or Perro as it is in English, may have been a local name for the stream that we now know as the River Pol. But again, it's a mystery likely lost to history. In the meantime, while we've been discussing the village name, we've wandered away from the harbour and onto Talland Hill, one of just a handful of named streets in central Polperro, where you'll find a combination of shops and cottages, many of which are where locals live, and a number of which are holiday homes where visitors stay in the heart of the village. Now, as we've mentioned, tourism plays a crucial part in Polperro's economy nowadays, and like so many other picturesque fishing villages around the country, quaint holiday homes are a draw for visitors, who then frequent local pubs, shops and market stalls, contributing to the village's economy. We're here walking about in June, just before things get really busy in Cornwall. But with the sun out, there's still plenty of people enjoying Polperro, a village which does well to balance the importance of tourism and the preservation of the village's heritage and historic character. Like many other places in Cornwall, over-tourism can be an issue at the peak of the summer season. But importantly, Polperro doesn't allow any visitor cars to drive down into the village centre here, keeping the narrow streets both emptier and quieter for people to enjoy strolling about. Meanwhile, most of the village's enterprises are locally run, meaning that the money tourists spend here helps to support the place they're visiting. For instance, just outside the local Methodist chapel here, built in 1904, there's a local produce and craft market, some of the profits from which are used for the church's upkeep. Undoubtedly, it's a difficult balance to strike, with the village's summertime popularity driving up house prices and making it harder for local people to live here, while in the winter months things can be very quiet, to the detriment of local businesses. But visiting Polperro is still a must if you ever find yourself in this part of Cornwall, the village located on the south coast, roughly 5 miles away from the popular seaside towns of Fore and Loo on either side. If you're looking to visit Polperro without a car, often a good idea during the summer when the roads are busy, then it's pretty simple to get here. The nearby town of Loo is just a 20-minute bus ride away, where you'll find a train station with easy connections to the national rail network. And if you do catch the bus to Polperro, it'll drop you up by the visitor car park, about a 10-minute walk away from the village centre, just at the top of this street, which is known as the Coombe. Gently gliding down the hill towards the seafront, the Coombe is a delightful spot in Polperro, following the route of the River Pol as it descends down towards the village centre, but with a little more open sky than the densely packed streets around the harbour, some lovely local shops and houses, and a few unusual local landmarks, including Polperro's own model village, to be found just off the side of the street here. A classic form of visitor attraction to be found all over the country, model villages provide a miniature perspective of either an imaginary or real-world village. And if you step through this mystical entrance into Polperro's model village, you'll be greeted with a wonderful display that showcases Polperro itself in miniature, with the higgledy-piggledy landscape of houses crowding around the harbour, faithfully recreated as a magnificent diorama. Opened as a tourist attraction back in the 1940s, Polperro's model village is popular with visitors of all ages, featuring an irresistibly nostalgic model railway too, well worth popping into to have a look either on your way into or out of the village centre. But long before this was the home of Polperro Model Village, this building was a forge cottage, a place where a smith once lived and worked, crafting metal goods for the people of this village. Located beside the trickling waters of the River Pol, the forge was one of a number of important local spots that were powered by the river. Further upstream towards the car park, you'll find the 18th century Crumplehorn Mill, a large mill and farmhouse which is now home to a delightful pub and hotel, as well as an old water wheel which is turned by the waters of the River Pol. Now, we won't quite have time to walk all the way up to the Crumplehorn Mill at the top of the Coombe, so let's make our way back down into the village centre once again, where we're going to explore a few more of Polperro's most charming streets and lanes. Of course, this approach towards the harbour was, and still is, the only reasonable way in and out of Polperro, the only exception being some very scenic but steep paths that follow the cliffs along the coast. As such, it makes sense that a number of inns were established here, such as the Ship Inn beside us. It was originally founded in the 18th century, and it's one of a number of taverns in Polperro with close links to the village's history of smuggling. Its landlord, one Charles Guy, coordinated much of the illegal trade between Polperro here and St. Peter Port, the capital of Guernsey. Located in the English Channel, roughly 100 miles from here, Guernsey was an important staging point for smuggled goods making their way towards Britain. And the route from there to Cornwall here was ideal for smugglers, as it was far from the main trading routes between Britain and the European continent, where the eyes of the law looked much more intently on boats making their way across the channel. Once these goods had safely made their way onto dry land here, many were whisked away into the hills to be sold all over Britain. But some may have been quietly sold right here on a street known as Big Green, the site of Polperro's historic village market. This white building is known as the Old Market House, where none other than John Wesley, the Methodist cleric who travelled preaching all over Britain, once stayed overnight back in 1760. But this was just one brief moment in the lengthy history of Polperro's markets, which have been in existence for almost as long as the village itself, with not only fish sold here, but agricultural produce from the surrounding farmland, grains from local mills, and almost certainly metalwares from the old forge that we visited a few moments ago. Today, the village square, home to this fetching Celtic cross placed here in the year 2000, is under a marquee for the Polperro Festival, an annual event held since 1996 to promote local businesses, but which now also features entertainment and plenty of other activities all over the village during the third week of June. Overlooking the festivities, meanwhile, is Nelson's Restaurant, a cleverly named eatery which was established back in 1974 by Betty, Peter and Tony Nelson. The Nelsons made smart use of their last name by lending the restaurant a nautical theme, now complete with a portrait and bust of none other than Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson above the doorway. Although in reality, Admiral Nelson likely had no personal association with this village. 50 years after the restaurant opened its doors, it's still going strong, and it remains one of the most popular spots in the centre of Polperro, standing just beside the waters of the River Pol as they flow beneath Saxon Bridge, which we're standing on just here. Much like Roman Bridge that we crossed earlier, this bridge doesn't date from the era of the Saxons. In fact, during the periods when much of Britain was being settled by Romans and later Anglo-Saxons, Cornwall here remained relatively untouched. The Romans did establish a sparing presence in Cornwall, but this remained a majority Celtic area for centuries. And when the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain and began spreading across what we now know as England, the Celtic Cornish took the side of the Danes, enemies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and spent the best part of 300 years fighting them off. Although ultimately, in the 9th century AD, the English came to establish greater control over Cornwall. Still, Cornwall retains its pride as a Celtic nation, and before Polperro here first appeared in official records around the time of the 13th century, this place was likely home to a small community of Celtic, Cornish-speaking fishing families for centuries. Over time, though, English people and the English language gained an ever greater influence in historic villages like this one. And Polperro as we see it today, with quaint old pubs like the Noughts Crosses, is mostly made up of streets and houses that date from the 18th century, when the development of fishing and smuggling saw the village begin to change faster than ever before. That being said, there's still plenty of traditional Cornish culture to discover in Polperro today. Just here, for instance, we find a shop named Joan the Wad, who in Cornish mythology is known as the Queen of the Piskies, magical fairies who live in the moorlands in the heart of Cornwall and neighbouring Devon. These pesky, pointy-eared fairies are the origin for what the rest of the world know as pixies. And at Joan the Wad here in Polperro, you can buy handmade piskie charms, jewels and figurines depicting traditional images of Joan the Wad herself and many other famous piskies of local Cornish folklore. Just next door to the heart of magical mythology, you'll find the historic Boatman's Cabin, one of the largest houses in the village centre, and one of a number of which were once the home of local fishing families, handily situated just a few steps away from where their boats were moored in the harbour. Now, as we know, Polperro to this day remains a working harbour, where fishermen still ply their trade day in and day out. But when the tide is out, we can actually wander into the harbour itself, and get a closer look at some of the famous landmarks which surround an area normally filled with water. Of course, if you are in Polperro and fancy taking a look around the harbour when the tide is out, watch your step and make sure not to get in the way of anybody working. But it can be well worth it to see this village from a completely different angle. Earlier we walked over the Roman bridge, but here we can get a look at the bridge from down below. The River Pol flows beneath this bridge of 1854, but the river crossing actually has a much longer history, having stood in a number of different shapes through the centuries, providing a crucial crossing point of the river in the middle of the village here, just beside the waters of the harbour. On this lovely summer's day, the harbour is tranquil, but that isn't the case all year round. Indeed, Polperro's harbour has been devastated on a number of occasions by great storms blowing in from the English Channel. In 1774 and 1817, areas of the harbour had to be rebuilt after storms destroyed parts of the stonework. But it was in November of 1824 that this village was hit by what's often called the worst storm in its history. That year, vicious winds and waves ripped through the mouth of the harbour and destroyed an entire pier, allowing the waves to rush deeper inland and wreak even more havoc on Polperro. And throughout the storm, 3 houses collapsed and more than 50 boats were either swept out to sea or simply destroyed, with just 6 surviving to tell the tale. But the people of Polperro rebuilt, and just here we find one of the most peculiar pieces of local architecture, the village's famous shell house. This house once looked like its neighbours, but in 1937 its owner, a naval man named Samuel Puckey, began applying seashells that he'd collected on his travels to the outside of his home. Arranging the shells in a variety of patterns, and even an image of the Eddystone Lighthouse off Plymouth further up the coast, it took more than 5 years for Puckey to complete the house as we see it today, a truly gorgeous piece of art that's now listed and preserved for posterity. As one of the most beautiful villages in Cornwall, and probably all of Britain, the village of Polperro is a work of art in its own right. And so it's no wonder that this village, famously associated with fishing and smuggling, has also gained a reputation among artists from all around the world. In the village today you'll find a number of quaint galleries where you can peruse local artworks. But through time, painters of many different eras have flocked here to capture Polperro's beauty on canvas. The harbour, of course, featuring in famous works by American artist Thomas Moran, the Dutch painter Hendrik Jan Volter, the acclaimed German artist Klaus Bergen, and so many more. Among all this beauty is, of course, a wealth of history. Each and every building that surrounds the picture-perfect harbour has centuries of stories to tell. The old watch house here, for example, dating from the early 19th century, having been built as a watchtower for the authorities during the peak of smuggling in Polperro. In the early days of smuggling, Polperro's geography may have allowed people to simply bring boatloads of contraband straight into the harbour. But as the village gained a bit of a reputation, and the eyes of the law established their own base right in the middle of the community, people had to be a little sneakier. As we learned earlier, local man Willy Wilcox used a cave by the harbour mouth to hide his goods, with the tunnel connected to his house above. And that is one of many captivating, swashbuckling stories that you can learn about here at Polperro's Heritage Museum of Smuggling and Fishing, situated in what was once upon a time one of the village's 3 pilchard factories, at a beautiful spot just beside the harbour. On our walk around the village, we've only just scratched the surface of Polperro's riveting history. But this museum has everything you need to know, and more, about this most beautiful of Cornish fishing villages, with photographs and relics from the heyday of smuggling more than 200 years ago, to countless items related to the village's centuries of fishing. And of course, when you step out of the museum, you're greeted with yet another incredible view of the centrepiece of Polperro's beauty, the harbour, around which historic houses and narrow lanes crowd, hiding within them an endless array of stories. But sadly, it's here that we've come to the end of our walk around the truly gorgeous village of Polperro, an unmissable destination on Cornwall's south coast, which more than delivers on its promise of beauty and rich heritage. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own trip to Polperro sometime soon.